Hi everyone, and welcome to another passage walkthrough video from the Shemmassian MCAT team. We hope you've had a chance to explore some of our other passage walkthrough videos, and the goal of this series is really to give you some tips, strategies, and insight into practice passages across all 4 sections of the MCAT, with the goal of you being able to apply some of the things you learn here to your own MCAT practice. So today we're going to work through a CARS passage. A lot of you may feel like CARS is your weakest section, and one of the biggest reasons students struggle with CARS is that AAMC and the MCAT test writers find very creative ways to trip students up. They're very creative in writing wrong answer choices that seem right. And so today we're going to go through some tips and tricks that'll hopefully help when it comes to your own practice. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we jump into the passage, I want to talk about a couple things. First, I want to largely split up CARS passages into a couple broad categories. So within the CARS section, generally speaking, you're going to get passages that fall into one of 2 categories. So you're either going to get persuasive passages, or you're going to get informative passages. And so the names do a pretty good job of breaking up the categories. In persuasive passages, the author is going to try to convince you about something. And so generally speaking, we can break persuasive passages up into a few more categories. So the author might try to convince us that something is good, neutral, or bad. And so now you might say, well, the MCAT CARS section probably has a little bit more nuance than good, neutral, and bad. And while that's largely true, by breaking it up into these large categories, we can actually eliminate quickly 2 to 3 answer choices from many of the questions. And so, yes, the CARS section needs you to understand and needs you to be able to critically think, but you don't necessarily have to memorize every detail from the passage or understand every single bit of nuance that the author is throwing at you. Especially when it comes to the harder passages, if you just have a general sense of if the author likes, is neutral towards, or is dislike something, then you'll have a good shot at some of the questions. So now we can break a persuasive passage up into good, neutral, and bad. We can also break it up into a couple other things. The author might be discussing one view only. The author might be discussing multiple views. And the author, in a section with under multiple views, will be aligning views or competing views. And now the MCAT CARS section loves this last part, right? They love to test you on different ideas and different perspectives introduced during the passage and comparing them to the other perspective, right? So they love when they can test you on whether or not 2 different perspectives or views from the passage align with one another, or if they're in direct competition with one another. So it's important to have a good sense of really what's going on in the passage, especially when it comes to these persuasive passages. In an informative passage, I won't break it up into some of the smaller subcomponents, but largely persuasive passages are where the MCAT can throw you these trickier questions. So with that covered, let's now look at a couple other things. So in this passage we take today, we're going to go through a specific strategy. So our strategy here is going to be, we're going to start with the paragraph outline. So as we read through, we're going to make a short summary of what we're reading. And so why do we do that, right? A lot of people go through the motions when it comes to strategies. They try things out. They do what they're told, right? A lot of people will tell you to make a paragraph outline. But why do we make a paragraph outline? And the goal is to make you actively read, right? If you're reading through a paragraph and you know at the end you're going to need to write down a 4 to 5 word summary of what was going on in that paragraph, you'll probably try to pick out the salient, pick out the big points from what you're reading. And so really that's why that paragraph outline is important. Very rarely are you going to come back to your paragraph outline and use it to answer a question. Instead, you'll use the understanding you gained from doing that paragraph outline to answer a question, Or you'll use the paragraph outline as a roadmap, right? As something that says, oh, this key piece of information was probably in this passage, so let me go back there. And that's the main reason we use that paragraph outline. Next, we're going to write the main idea of the passage, right? This is important for synthesizing everything, for putting all the pieces together. And finally, when we look at our answer choices, what we're going to do is we're first going to predict our answer choices. And I've already talked a little bit about how the test writers love to trip students up, right? They love to write answer choices in tricky ways that make students second guess themselves or misinterpret the passage. But if you can predict what you think the answer choice is going to be beforehand, you're less likely to fall into some of these traps that the test writers will throw at you. So once we predict our answer choices, then we can use process of elimination. And sometimes we won't be able to predict our answer choices, and we'll go through a couple examples of that today. And finally, my reminder for today's passage, and something you can apply to your own practice. If you're stuck between two answer choices, I want you to do one of two things. One, choose the answer choice that required fewer assumptions to be made, or two, choose the answer choice with more supporting text evidence. So let's look at that first piece, right? Fewer assumptions. What do I mean by that? Unlike the other three sections of the MCAT, CARS doesn't require you to have any outside knowledge, right? You're better off without historical knowledge, without philosophical knowledge, because all that knowledge is going to do is give you information that you think might be related to the passage, right? And that in the information that's not directly written in the passage itself can't be tested on. And so for that reason, it's important to throw all of your assumptions out of the window when it comes to the MCAT CARS section. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the passage for today. All right, so I'm going to zoom in here, and we're going to go through this passage together. And like I said, we're going to start off by making a paragraph summary, right? So I'm going to have you take the next 20 or so seconds to read this paragraph, and I'll also read it out loud. In the past century, the world has seen a rapid decline in thousands, no hundreds of thousands of trees. Deforestation has ravaged our forests. Wildlife has been displaced, and the ecological damage that has occurred is potentially irreparable. The decisions that world governments make over the next 50 years will be of the utmost importance if we are to save our planet and prevent a transition into an unrecognizable world, or one dominated by a lack of nature. In addition to decisions made by individual governments, collective action as a planet as a whole must be taken. So now, in 4 to 5 words, take 10 seconds to think, what would you write as your paragraph summary here? Okay, so what I would write here is save environment. I'm going to abbreviate, right? Environ, I know that's going to be environment for me in my shorthand. And now I'm going to say we want the government and people to do this, right? So now in 4 to 5 words, in bad handwriting, I've done a pretty good job of summarizing what the gist of this passage was. So let's move on to the next one. Okay. Intergovernmental coordination, however, must be undertaken with extreme care, and it requires several tenets to be functional. First, countries must individually recognize the presence of a problem. Second, countries must be willing to sacrifice unequal levels of resources to fix problems that have been agreed upon by a committee. Here, it is important to raise a concern. How will an environmental committee be created? How many delegates will each country receive? Will countries with more environmental damage receive additional delegates, or rather, will countries who have preserved their resources receive a greater say? And finally, countries must be willing to agree to enforce decisions. All right, so with that in mind, go ahead and take 10 seconds to write down what you think the paragraph summary would be here. All right, so what I'm going to write here is intergovernment, again, abbreviating, coordination tenets, right? I think that's the gist of what's going on here. They're outlining a few different tenets specifically two, right, that are going to be required for this so-called intergovernmental coordination. All right, let's move on to the next paragraph. The easiest lens through which to analyze the potential pros and cons of collective governmental action to address climate change is through a particular policy. Carbon taxes have been introduced in recent years, and many companies have pledged carbon neutrality by a year in the future. Unfortunately, the future date these companies will have too small of an impact and occur too late. If countries instead were to set a stringent date for carbon neutrality, action would occur much more quickly. So we have actually a few interesting things going on in this paragraph. Before we jump into that, I want you to take 10 seconds to come up with what you think a good paragraph summary would be here. All right, so a couple interesting things are happening here. One, we're getting an example, and the MCAT loves to test you on examples that were given in any given passage or paragraph. So here, what is our example? The example we're looking at is carbon taxes, right? The author even says the easiest way to analyze the pros and cons of governmental action, a collective governmental action, is through a particular policy, right? The author's trying to make it easier on us to understand this topic. And so our summary here can be the carbon tax example. So now another interesting thing, an important thing for you to pick up on when you take your actual MCAT CARS section and when you take other MCAT CARS practice passages, is that the author, any time an author's opinion shows up, it's very important to recognize that. Because again, the test writers love to test you and see if you're picking up on these small details. And so here, the author's actually making a pretty strong statement, right? The author's saying the carbon tax is not working. Unfortunately, the future date these companies will have too small of an impact and occur too late. And then the author's actually proposing a solution. If countries instead were to do X, Y, Z, then they might be successful. And so this is an important piece to pick up on that might come back later when we look at the questions. And so I'm going to put carbon tax example plus author opinion / solution, right? So what the author is identifying as the problem with the carbon tax and what the author thinks the solution might be. All right, let's get to the next one. So in the context of our aforementioned intergovernmental coordination, the first step must be recognition of the problem. Scientific studies have shown the dangers of excessive carbon production on global climate change, but the general population in several countries has yet to be convinced. A recent survey of the American population showed that 33% do not believe in climate change at all. The younger generation should catalyze change in education, and young parents must instill values of environmental conservation in their children. Only then can a lofty goal of carbon neutrality begin to percolate into the collective conscious of society. And so what we're talking about here is recognizing the problem, right? The author discusses that, a lot of people haven't recognized the problem, and then potentially some ways to mitigate that in the future. So to be short and sweet, let's just put recognizing the problem. Okay, great. All right, let's move on to the next paragraph. Next, countries with more resources will inevitably spend more to help fix the global problem. The countries must accept not a duty to themselves as a country, but a duty to the world as reducing our collective environmental impact depends upon a collective effort, even if some countries must recognize their world position and contribute more resources. So now, what are we looking at here? Go ahead and take 10 seconds to come up with a quick paragraph summary for this shorter paragraph. So here, why don't we just put duty to world, right? And so you've noticed I put to instead of to, right? That's just to illustrate the point that you can use whatever shorthand works for you, right? Nobody's going to come and look at your notes and say, oh, well, that's points off because you used the number 2 instead of to, right? The whole point of these notes is that they should be quick, easy for you to recognize, and again, with the goal that you're actively synthesizing as you're reading in order to create these smaller summaries. All right, let's go ahead and look at our final paragraph. So, finally, in what will be the most difficult problem to address, the intergovernmental coordination will need to devise a way to enforce decisions in the collective sense of responsibility. The first solution to come to mind is economic sanctions, but economists have pointed out that economic sanctions will hurt both the country in violation and the countries who have followed the guidelines. In turn, this will make the conservation effort even more costly. Creative solutions will need to be devised to handle this final, difficult problem if we are to preserve our planet. All right, so what are we talking about in this final paragraph? So go ahead and take a few seconds to write your summary. All right, so here we're talking about the sense of responsibility, right? This last piece. And then we're also talking about economic sanctions. So let's put sense of responsibility plus econ sanctions. All right, great. So now we've made it through this passage. And before we jump on to the questions, what do we think a main idea of the passage would be? What do we think the big picture of the passage is? So go ahead and take 10 to 15 seconds to come up with what you think that big idea might be. All right, so before we jump into what you put, I think it's important to recognize and to go back and identify what kind of passage do we think this is, right? Is this a persuasive passage or is this an informative passage, right? It's likely a persuasive passage, right? So it's persuasive. And how does the author feel about kind of where we are currently with climate change? Good, bad, or neutral? Probably bad, right? But what does the author think about the future, right? Is the author optimistic or is the author pessimistic? So I think the author has a little bit of cautious optimism, right? That's the tone we get from the passage as we read it. The author has a little bit of cautious optimism about the future. The author recognizes things might be hard, but things might get better in the future if we follow some of these recommendations, right? So overall, I think the overall tone could kind of be good. In addition, now, do we have one view, multiple, or multiple views? And if multiple views, are they in agreement or are they in disagreement? So really, the author is more or less presenting the author's view, right? We're primarily getting the author's view here. We're getting some counter arguments, but the author is refuting them as we get them. And so that's one way we can kind of analyze this as a persuasive piece. So now, what's the main idea? So the main idea we can say here is an exploration of environmental policy, right? It's a pretty general main idea. And we get some of the pros and the cons, and we have some of the author's ideas, right? Plus potential problems and solutions, right? We have some of what the author thinks might work. All right, so let's go ahead and move on here to our questions. So, if true, which of the following statements weakens the author's claim about the effectiveness of economic sanctions? So, a couple things we want to do. First of all, we're looking at an if true, right? So this is going to be a reasoning beyond the text question. They're going to give us 4 statements that were not seen in the text that we have to assume if they were true, how do they affect what's going on in the text? So if true, which of the following statements weakens the author's claim about the effectiveness of economic sanctions? So now, what should we do before we even look at any of those answer choices? We might not be able to predict what this answer choice is, but at the very least we should do one important thing here. And I've highlighted it, which might make it easier. But what we want to do is we want to figure out what the author was claiming about the effectiveness of economic sanctions, right? It's going to be difficult for us to answer this question without that information. And so now, if we look back to our outline, where do we see economic sanctions, right? We saw them here. So we're going to look in this last paragraph. And so the author here says, economists have pointed out that economic sanctions will hurt both the country in violation and the countries who have followed the guidelines and make things more costly, right? Okay, so with that information in mind, let's see what will challenge that, right? So let's say that the claim hurts both countries. So now what we're doing is we're looking for something that wouldn't necessarily hurt both countries. So let's look at answer choice A. If a country imposes a tariff on importations from another country, the country carrying out the importation will receive the heavier economic burden. So this is a tricky answer. And again, like we mentioned a couple times earlier, the MCAT loves to trip you up on tricky wording. And so here, the word heavier is very important, right? Because it implies one country might have, and let's just use numbers, right? Let's just use random numbers. Let's say on a scale of 0, with 0 being no economic burden, and 10 being a bunch of economic burden, let's say the country carrying out the importation, which receives the heavier economic burden, receives a 10, right? That doesn't tell us anything else about the other one. The other one could be at a 9 still, right? So both countries could still be hurt. And so if both countries can be hurt, then it doesn't affect the author's claim, right? So we can go ahead and get rid of A. Now let's look at B. Economists who calculate economic damage upon the introduction of sanctions often overestimate inter-country dependency. So now this is actually an interesting answer choice, right? So if one country imposed sanctions on another country, what this answer choice is saying, because we've now presumed it to be true, is that one of the countries could actually not be affected, right? Because it's saying that the countries are actually potentially functioning independently of one another. And so now answer choice B is looking pretty good. Answer choice C, two countries who simultaneously introduce economic restrictions on each other will encounter economic damage. So now this is exactly what they were saying, right? This is exactly what the author was saying, so boom, we can get rid of C, right? If something hurts both countries, right, then that's not going to be our answer choice. Economic damage from sanctions will produce even worse political relationship strains. And so now this is an answer choice that's kind of coming out of nowhere, right? It doesn't really have any relevance to the question they're asking. And as such, we can get rid of it. So here, B is going to be our best answer choice. Oops. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. So let's go to question number 2. Which of the following statements is the author of the passage most likely to agree with? And so here, you can't really predict, right? You're better off looking at the answer choices to get a sense of where they're going with the question, and then you can go from there. So let's go ahead and start with answer choice A. Environmental initiatives currently in place are sufficient to handle short-term environmental issues. So now, as your gut feeling, do you think the author feels this way? Probably not, right? And so if we go back even to our carbon tax passage or paragraph, you can see that the author was actually pretty pessimistic about this, right? Unfortunately, the future date these companies have set will have too small of an impact, occur too late. So the author really isn't happy with how things are currently going, right? And so we can go ahead and get rid of A. Cooperation between governments will be impossible. So anytime you see such an extreme word like impossible, right? Bells and whistles should be going off in your head. You should be very, very cautious and weary when you get things like impossible, right? That's a very negative, strong word. If you can even come up with one counterexample as to how it would maybe be possible, then you can get rid of B, right? If it's impossible, the author needed to say in clear terms that it's impossible, never going to happen, not going to happen, no, right? And the author doesn't say that. The author is providing some suggestions for how cooperation between governments could work. And so for that reason, we can pretty comfortably get rid of B. All right, let's go to C. Society has not yet achieved the first step needed to enact climate conservation. So what's the author's first step for climate conservation? Well, if we go back to this passage, to this paragraph, the first step must be recognition of the problem. Now, when we choose an answer for the MCAT, it's always helpful to have text evidence from the passage. Remember how we said earlier, in the answers you choose need to have evidence from the text passage. You don't have to pull outside information that you know right, to get these questions right. And so here, they're giving us the answer, right? The first step must be recognition of the problem. And then, here the author says, the general population in several countries has yet to be convinced, right? So with that being said, we have a pretty good sense that, we haven't even gotten the first thing down yet. So we're feeling pretty good about C. And let's look at D. Most conservation efforts are inexpensive, and the administrative costs make them more costly than necessary. And so that's not something that the author is arguing during the passage, right? And that's not something we saw come up. So now, with that, we're pretty confident that C is looking like our right answer. All right, according to the author, an unrecognizable world would include, so anytime you get quotes, right, anytime you get quotation marks on your MCAT CARS section, it means those exact same words show up somewhere in the passage. So sometimes they'll tell you where that is, sometimes they won't. Here they don't, but we need to go find it because that's where our answer is going to be. So before we even look at the answer choices, we need to go see where they mentioned unrecognizable world. And so if we go back to this first paragraph, we can see here in this sentence, the decisions that world governments make over the next 50 years will be of the utmost importance if we are to save our planet and prevent a transition into an unrecognizable world or one dominated by a lack of nature. And so now, what is the author saying an unrecognizable world is? It's one dominated by a lack of nature. And so now, with that in mind, let's go back to our, let's go back to our question here. Okay, so let me erase these things. All right, so an unrecognizable world is one without a lot of nature, right? And so let's look at answer choice A, a lack of forest due to deforestation. That looks pretty good, right? So honestly, looking at that, even on my real test, I would feel pretty confident that A is the right answer choice. But let's go through the rest. Corporations setting 50-year carbon neutrality goals, nope. It doesn't have anything to do with nature. Intergovernmental cooperation, okay. Rational goals, nope. No nature. Intragovernmental, nope. Cooperation, no nature, right? So pretty quickly we can get rid of answer choices B, C, and D there. All right. Which of the following is most likely the reason the author includes a series of rhetorical questions in paragraph 2? So let's go back to paragraph 2. Okay. And so the questions that question is referring to are here. Right here, it is important to raise a concern. How will an environmental committee be created? How many delegates will each country receive? Will countries with more environmental damage receive additional delegates, or rather will countries who have preserved their resources receive a greater say? So the author is kind of just bringing up a bunch of different points. And if somebody was asking you this, you might get a little bit flustered, right? If somebody's asking you all of these questions. And it seems that the author is really just trying to illustrate the complexity of the situation. So that can be our prediction here, right? Let me scroll down here. Right, so our prediction can just be that it's a very complex issue. So now let's look at the answers, now that we have our prediction. So to illustrate the level of thought the author's given to the subject, okay, maybe, but there might be a better answer. To show readers the complexity of creating an environmental committee, right? So we actually wrote the word complex, so complexity looks pretty good. To ask the reader to brainstorm and write down potential solutions to a problem. So that's kind of an assumption, right? Assuming that the author wanted you to actually take those rhetorical questions literally and write stuff down, That seems like a couple steps too far. And to demonstrate the need to first agree upon a problem that an environmental committee would need to fix. Again, we're really thinking that it's a complex issue and the author is trying to illustrate that. And so for that reason, B is looking like a better answer choice here. All right, so now let's look at our final question. Let's look at our final question here. The author most likely believes which of the following about carbon neutrality. And so now this is really where your good, bad, or neutral can come into play. And this is something we talked about when we looked at our main idea. But here the author feels cautiously optimistic about carbon neutrality. It might happen at some point in the future. It's going to be hard to get there, but if we take the right steps, we can probably make it there. So we can put something like cautiously optimistic. All right, so now let's look at our answer choices. It's an easily achievable goal with the right leadership. Nope. It's a difficult goal to achieve regardless of cooperation and leadership. Right? Maybe. Right? We have, it's a difficult goal. That's something that the author thought. Whatever we do, it's still going to be hard. So maybe that's kind of fitting in line with that cautious optimism. It's an impossible goal to achieve and society can only try its best. Again, with things like impossible, they're too strong, right? Unless the author is being that strong in the passage, we can't choose an answer choice that says impossible. And then intergovernmental cooperation will supersede the need to focus on carbon neutrality. And so again, the author is not ranking these things, right? The author is not saying, okay, well, first we need to make sure the carbon tax works, and then we need to make sure the governments cooperate, and then we need to take care of the water. The author doesn't tell us any of that information. And so we can't reasonably assume that intergovernmental cooperation will supersede the need to focus on carbon neutrality. And so for that reason, we can get rid of D. And so here, B, even though it's not the prettiest answer, right? It doesn't seem perfect based off of our prediction of cautiously optimistic. It's the one that fits the best with what we predicted. So with that, I hope you got some insight into how you can approach these passages and some of these more challenging questions. Feel free to check out our other passage walkthrough videos. In addition, I hope you can check out some of our 528 series where we provide some additional strategies and tips for each of the important sections of the MCAT. So with that being said, thank you for sticking around. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe so you can get future videos, and you can please also like this video. With that being said, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.